Morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are tuning into us today. Welcome to another edition of the Stronger Futures Project. I am Stanley Dietrich, your host, and we truly have a transformational discussion lined up for you today. Imagine if you turned your challenges into opportunities and you took radical responsibility and you moved your elevation to greater heights, and it really all comes down to radical responsibility. Well, today's host, my co-host, we're going to be diving deep into this conversation and taking radical ownership of our own lives. We're going to explore the responsibility to unlock your true potential and unparalleled success and fulfillment. I am in the midst of I'm going to call her a superstar. Now she'll be very humble and say she's not a superstar, but when you are in the company of those that are not only displaying it, not only teaching it, but they live it. It's just part of their innate identity, and you just know that. And that's who my guest is, and I am honored to have her here. And so she is the founder of Genuinely You Limited, empowering dynamic spiritual leaders. So I'm going to let Gina share a little bit more about her because I don't want to mess it up. And I want to honor her for being here. So buckle up, and you're about to embark on a journey that could change everything. Gina, take it away.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. By the way, if you're watching or listening to this, I didn't pay him, although I would pay for an introduction like that. I'm very passionate about helping people step into their best lives, really. And I think for me, the radical responsibility and the why that's so important is when you take radical ownership or radical responsibility for your own life, it's not your conditioning that's running your life. It's not other people. It's you. And as a result of that, you have the capacity to grow in a very different way when you're trying to please other people, or you feel constrained to do things in a particular way or be a particular way because you think that that's how it should be. And that, it's important to say, doesn't mean going out to make life difficult for other people. Quite the opposite. But it is about being the authentic, genuine version of you. And so everything I do, whether I'm doing a keynote speech or whether I'm coaching or training or consulting, whatever I'm doing, it all boils down to personal empowerment, because you can't lead others in an enlightened, conscious way unless you lead yourself. And then how do you become a leader? And then how do you become a leader of leaders? So it all boils down to the same stuff.
That's amazing. And I love the way you said how it should be. We think of how it should be. What made you want to go into this? What was your defining moment that brought you to this awareness?
I don't think it was one moment, if I'm really honest. If you'd asked my parents, who have long since left us, how I was as a child, I wanted to help people. And, I used to teach my dollies and make the cat's life a misery, making the cat be my pupil, long before I articulated that I wanted to teach. And that was my beginning of my professional journey. I was a teacher. And I suspect that that's still, a very deep-rooted desire, is to give people the tools with which to live their better life. And I was promoted very early, so I became the principal or the head teacher of a school when I was 29, a whole set of circumstances. And so rather than teaching children, for the most part, it became teaching adults. And then when I left headship in 2004, it's been generally working with adults. And in my view, adults are just big kids, and very often they're much more childish than children are. I think we need to be more childlike rather than childish. And so it's giving people, first and foremost, permission to be their authentic selves, rather than the wearing the mask that they feel that they've got to. So being authentic, and then recognizing that we're not broken. There's always areas for development. We're on a lifelong journey of evolution if we choose to be. But ultimately, it's learning to love who you are. And I want to make the distinction between loving oneself and being indulgent. They're two very different things as far as I'm concerned.
So I love the way that you said that it wasn't one defining moment, and I asked that question because some days you can walk in and you can walk into your own life, and it's like a light switch goes on, and it was all around you, and you were oblivious to it, and like you said, you weren't able to articulate it as you. It was your proclivity, it was your tendency, it was what drew your attention. And so I want to give that freedom to our listeners as well, is that it may not be just one event, it may be a culmination that come together and create that desire, whatever it is that is in your life, whatever it is that you're wanting to achieve or wanting to accomplish. That it's a culmination of all the things that we look at as there's a verse in the Bible that says all things work together for the good of those who love the Lord. Now, all things. So I am who I am because of the things that weren't so favorable, and also the things that were favorable. And it's the unfavorable instances that drew my attention. And so when you're talking about radical responsibility and you go into corporations and you work with individuals, do you see the difference between, or is there no difference? Like, because we're all people, how do you help people bring those together where the personal is not separate from the professional? And I think so many times we as leaders, or especially in the personal development world, we can separate those, but they're not separate. Can you?
We are the common denominator that we take into every moment of our life, from the moment we're conceived until we pass on in this world, and who knows what happens then. And I think you're right. So many people compartmentalize their life. I'm a parent, I'm a partner, I'm a professional. The reality is that we take ourselves into every moment. And there's a saying that how we do one thing is how we do everything.
Right.
That may not be strictly true, because there are many people who you see a different mask when they're being the professional. And sometimes they're hugely confident when they're being a professional, or at least they look that way. And at home that they're shy, or vice versa. But when you get beyond the mask, we are that same person. And the principles and strategies that I teach and I work with people to help them embed into their lives are principles for life. So taking radical responsibility. Let's just talk about what that means in real terms. If you want a better life, you've got to think better thoughts, because our thoughts drive our beliefs, our emotions, our actions, and our words. But 95% of our thoughts are habitual. They go in patterns that we never question. And so because we don't question them, they drive our thoughts, our beliefs, our behaviors, and our actions. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Have you ever been in a situation where somebody has said something and the response that's come from that comment or that sentence has been completely disproportionate when you look at what was actually said? And it's because it's triggered something that's happened before, a naggy parent or a teacher that you didn't like. And
Right.
so instead of being proactive, you're very reactive.
Mhm.
So I say something to you, you react, and your react is to bite back because you haven't listened to what's being said. You've listened to the tone of voice or the body language, or you've anticipated what's being said. You've then bitten back. That's triggered the other person. And before you know where you are, you've got a full-blown row. And when you start to analyze it, people will often say, well, it's not what you said, it was the way in which you said it.
Right.
And so if you are conscious, and for me, conscious leadership, the first thing is awareness. Be the journalist of your life, an old-fashioned journalist who really looked at patterns and didn't make up things. But what are the patterns that are running your life? And if they're empowering and they're great, keep them. But if they're not, you have a choice. You can change them.
Yeah. And I want to say that even in my own life, I'm looking for an answer.
Yeah.
And I'm looking for it to be answered the way that I'm looking for it to be answered. Yeah.
It's really common, isn't it? And
Yes.
interestingly, don't you think we live at a time where the pace of change has never been greater and where uncertainty is one of the few constants that we
Mhm.
have in life? So, what do we as human beings try to do? We want to control that uncertainty. And so, your wish to have an answer that fits what you think it ought to be becomes ever greater. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why we're in such a mess at the moment is because we are trying to define how things should be rather than look and be curious about how things could be.
Right. Right. And uh, Tony uses an example where he says, the guy asks the girl out and she says no. And he's like, she's rejecting me. And he goes, well, it's not just, does no mean not now? Or does no mean, no, I'd never want to go to lunch with you? Or no, I already have plans, maybe tomorrow. And
Yes.
when we're listening for that, and when we ask somebody to do something, it's also the tone and the response that we are presenting it in, and we can um, preface it with, hey, this is not anything that is you're doing wrong, but and could you also take a look at this? So is it that you don't see this in this position here that needs to be moved and put away? Or, how do you just divert it? And some people are just obvious or oblivious to the obvious to us.
But
And what,
we all, sorry, I interrupted you, but we all interpret the world through our beliefs.
yes,
It's why it's so important to look at your beliefs. They're installed when we're tiny, and very often people don't look at them again. And so those beliefs drive our life. So, two small examples. Roger Bannister, the first 4 minute miler, was told that if he ran that fast, he would die. The
right,
medics at the time didn't believe you could run that fast and get enough oxygen. That he ran the 4 minute mile, I think, is amazing. But within a month, over 30 other people had done the same. What had changed? Their belief. I can run a 4 minute mile or sub 4 minute mile and live.
right,
So that's when they decided to do it. But an even more straightforward example, you're in a park. There is one dog and two people. Let's imagine it's us. So you had a dog when you were young, and your dog was very much like the one in the park. So when the dog approaches you, you know how to say hello to it without being threatening. And the dog wags its tail and smiles at you, and your belief that all dogs are friendly is confirmed. I, on the other hand, had a bad experience when I was little. The dog comes up to me, I start waving my arms about and shrieking. The dog gets frightened and growls. My belief that all dogs are a threat is confirmed.
yeah,
Same dog. But we act differently and we make assumptions all the time. We assume people's motives. Somebody's walking along the street and you wave and they ignore you. Many people think they've rejected me. How could they do that? I thought they were my friend. And this whole story goes on when the reality is that person was trying to remember something, was really busy, and was completely oblivious to everybody
right.
because they were doing their own thing.
Yeah, I had my daughter pass me on the road, and I was entranced into the book that I was listening to. So
Mm.
I'm just focused on making sure that there's nothing that's going to come in front of my vehicle, and I'm just driving. And they said, "Hey, we saw you on the road." I'm like, "I didn't see you." Said, "Yeah, we were waving and everything, and you were just looking straight ahead." I said, "I was entranced in my book," and it wasn't that I was avoiding them, or
No.
I was just so entranced into my experience and how often this happens. And when I take that responsibility of going, it's not about me and it's not about them, it's just about the moment.
And when you take radical responsibility for yourself, it's so it is a life changer. So, for example, many people, you will hear them say, "He made me so angry," or "She
Mm.
made me so unhappy." Well, the reality is, no, you allowed them to. Now, of course, there are people who are being unreasonable and unkind, but ultimately, it's you who decides whether or not you are going to own their anger or
Mhm.
you're going to leave them to own their anger. It's you who decides how you're going to respond. And sometimes it's appropriate to respond in a way which says, "Don't treat me like that," but without all of the emotional charge and the big drama which goes on day after day after day because you've been rejected or somebody has been emotionally inappropriate towards you. But that's when you own yourself, you will set boundaries. And so when you truly love who you are, that's why that relationship is so important. You won't stay with people who treat you badly. You won't stay in an organization that doesn't treat you well. You will have the facility to see that coming much sooner than if you think this is what I deserve and people treat me badly, but everybody treats me badly. And what can I do about it? There's nothing I can do about it.
Right.
It's a very different way of living.
Yeah. The phrase that nothing has any meaning except the meaning that I give it.
Absolutely. And if you're going to create a story, why not make yourself the hero or the heroine rather than the victim or the villain? You interpret your life and you how you turn up in your life moment by moment. Every choice you make, remember, everything you do is a choice. But when we don't actively choose, that's often when the impact is most far-reaching, because every choice we make has consequences.
Yeah.
And so being mindful, being aware, being conscious of the choices that you are making moment by moment gives you a very different quality of life than if you just let life happen to you.
Right. Right. And a lot of those events that we think that are happening to us are actually happening for us, and
Yes.
they're refining. And as you said earlier, that 95% of the thoughts that we think are actually negative, and they're actually the same thought that we thought the day before and the day before and the day before. So we have this capacity to take this radical responsibility, and that radical responsibility is, what are we saying to ourselves? What is the thing that we're reciting in the morning? And I've had people that say, it's just another one of those days. And I'm like, what is one of those days that it's another one of? Why don't you create a different day? Because it's not the same day of another day. It's a new day. And we're, you know, physically we're different people than we were 3 months ago, because we don't have the same cells. We don't have the same blood that's in us. We don't have the same skin. We've shedded. Yet we see ourselves in an image, and then we kind of project that onto others, and taking that radical responsibility. One of the dawning, like, it was like lightning that went off.
Yeah.
I was annoyed by an activity that was taking place, and it was presented to me, and the presentation was, were they capable of doing what you had asked? And I said, well, yeah, they were capable of doing what I asked. They're adults. And then the next question was, prove to me that they were capable of it. And I had to think about that.
Mhm.
And when I thought about it, then the next question was, show me how they've displayed what they agreed to doing. And I couldn't.
No.
And it was like I started laughing, because it freed me now, because what my agreement was with this person, or the crew, or
Mhm.
the owner of the company, um, they weren't capable of that capacity, although they agreed to it. They agreed in a superficial way,
Well,
but
they agreed to their version of it, not
yeah,
the same as yours.
yeah, and they weren't capable. And the one thing was, when I worked for a company and I said I don't want to be traveling. Okay, that's fine. And then 3 months, 4 months in, it was like, can you just go there for a day? And we're really shorthand. Can you stay there for 3 days? And
Mhm.
then 3 days turned into 3 weeks. And then I said, hey, look, um, this is not part of our agreement. And it's also wrestling season. So my son wrestles. I don't miss his meets. And, then there was this tiff.
Yeah.
And it was, they weren't really capable of upholding what they said just to get me to work for them. And if
When
free
you
was freeing.
when you look at business leadership, it's really interesting how very often you would hear business leaders say, if only you could get the right staff, if only the staff did what you wanted them, if only they'd leave me alone to get on with my work. And then when you actually get in there, what you discover is that they have actively been training people to do the very things they don't want.
Yes.
So, to give you an example, I worked with a dental laboratory. The owner of the laboratory was very successful when I first started working with them, even more successful when I finished working with them. Um, but the owner was also a senior lab tech. And everybody, when I first started working with them, everybody was on piece rate. They worked incredibly long hours. They worked in silos. And all of the work, particularly the complicated work, had to come through him to say whether or not it was a good job and whether it was going to go out to the dentist. So he was constantly being interrupted by people because he, on some days, he would allow a certain standard, but on other days when he was grumpy, it wasn't good enough. And so when I first started, it was actually, we don't need to work with them to start with. We need to work with you. Because ultimately, how are you training your people?
Mm-hmm.
And I likened it to when I go back to teaching, the teachers who would say, if you want to ask a question, put your hand up. Child would put its hand up and go, miss, 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 miss. And they would answer them and then say, next time, put your hand up. But ultimately, they were training those children to put their hand up and shout out. And he was doing the same. But
Mm.
by then creating a training culture, and it didn't happen overnight, these things take about 9-10 months in my experience. We together created a situation where everybody was trained to be the arbiter of what does excellence look like. And this works in pretty well any context. What does excellence look like in the
Mhm.
context, on this occasion, of an implant or a crown or a denture? It could be in a hotel, in a bathroom of cleanliness, or in a restaurant. What does excellence look like in terms of this meal? Or if you're in a manufacturing industry, what does excellence look like in terms of this particular process? But
Mm.
then when you articulate that with the people involved and come to a common agreement of what excellence looks like, they can then measure their own work in a very different way than if the boss is the only person who knows what excellence is. And moreover, that moves depending on what sort of mood you're in. Within 10 months, they were all on salaries. They worked significantly less hours. They were much more productive. They worked as a team. Thursdays was trading day, and everybody in the institution took charge in running the trading day, even their apprentices. So they were doing research, all sorts of stuff in their own time to bring back, and their profits doubled. Why? Because the business leader had become a true leader, a conscious, enlightened leader who valued his staff and who recognized if there's a problem, the first thing I need to do is to look to me. Am I delegating appropriately? The fact that I say it doesn't mean that they hear it. Do they
Right.
understand it? How do we move forward? And it's not rocket science at its most it's simple and yet it's complex, but at its
Right.
most simple level, it is how do we create a shared language where we have the same understanding of the words that we use, and we share the same values and the same vision, and everybody has ownership of delivering that.
Yeah, there was many things going through my mind. Um, the it's simple, but it's complex. So I saw Chris Voss do this demonstration where he would bring this finger in and keep the thumb up, and then bring the other thumb up to where you're doing this. But it's to do it simultaneously, it is so difficult and
Yeah.
it takes practice. It's a very simple thing to drop the thumb and pull this finger in, and then but we want to move it out instead of up. And it's a simple thing, but it's complex. And it's learning, even in my own body, it's a complex to do that. And then there was as a time when I worked for Boeing military aircraft, and the president of the company came from Seattle. And I don't know, it was probably a $3,000, $4,000 suit. And in a clean white room, he's walking, and all of a sudden he stops and he gets on the floor and he reaches under a table and he sweeps his arms and he pulls dust out in a white room. Now, white glove room is supposed to be really clean.
Mm-hmm.
And he looked at his sleeves and he brushed them off and he said, "That won't ever happen again, will it?" And then he kept going. He didn't reprimand anybody,
No,
but he displayed a level of leadership that was not blaming or shaming.
no,
He just was saying, "This won't happen again." And it was a reflection of true leadership.
yes.
And by not blaming and not shaming, it was something that always stayed with me. Like it was one of those that I'll never ever forget. And that's been 30 some years ago. Um, and it is the leader creating that culture and displaying and also articulating and being able to decipher what it is that the expectation is by
Mhm.
example, and then move on.
I think there's so much in that, the non-judgmental, the
Yes.
that, and I think that people have to learn, and you have to have a culture where if we never fail, we're never learning.
Right.
If we never fail, we'd still be living in caves.
Right.
But it's about creating a culture where rather than it being seen as a failure, it's seen as an opportunity to learn. But of course, there is a point where if people keep making the same mistakes, that needs to be dealt with. Is it a training issue? Is it that somebody's just being difficult? What's going on there? But I think so many leaders are very good at sitting in their ivory towers and telling people, you do it this way. They don't walk the talk. They don't know their people. There's not that sense of connection. If you have a leader who is with their team, who engages them and looks for the potential within the team and nurtures it, people will walk through fire for them because they know that they're valued. We all need to feel valued for our contribution. And I think one of the big things moving forward, and if you're listening to this and you are the leader, whether it's a leader of a family or a leader of a big institution, we, I believe, are a watershed. I think that the thinking that got us to where we are now, and the world's in a pretty challenging place at the moment.
Mhm.
But I think for those people who recognise that we need to value our people, and we need to value the world and the environment, and to leave a living legacy that is a positive one. So legacy is something many people think about. Well, I'm going to leave my children a legacy when I die, or I'll leave a charity a legacy, without recognizing that we are leaving a living legacy moment by moment, by
Yeah.
every word we speak, how and when we speak it, or whether we speak it at all, every action we take. So dropping a piece of litter in the street leaves a living legacy. for wildlife, for the aesthetics of the place, every word we speak. So if I said to you, Stanley, oh, thank you for having me on the show, absolute pleasure. That's got a very different legacy to saying to somebody, thank you. Very different energy, very different way of being.
Mhm.
And I think this is all about our awareness and our consciousness of how we are operating. And that's what I mean about taking radical responsibility. Go back to the habitual way of thinking and being. Some of that might be really positive, but very often we are, even if it's being positive, we're not fully making the most of that particular time. That if we were aware, that we would, enjoy it. How many wonderful moments go past and that we're just oblivious to them. I'm sitting here as we record this, I'm looking at my courtyard and the beautiful, I love my garden, it's full of colour. And every time I walk past these windows, I have huge gratitude for how wonderful nature is.
Mhm.
But you have to be in that moment. And if you're constantly worrying about the past or anxious about the future, you miss what's going on in the moment. And life goes by so quickly. It's such a shame it doesn't cost any money. It just costs your conscious awareness to engage. And even on the days when they're dark and life is difficult and you hurt or the cat's been sick and the car won't start, there are still things to be grateful for. And that can recalibrate your brain and help you live a much better quality of life. As I say, it costs nothing. So why
Right.
don't we all do it?
Right. When you're talking about that leaving a legacy, um, the great resignation that we've seen in the workforce, absenteeism is what a lot of people were talking about, but there's also presenteeism where
Very
you
costly.
you can be physically there but totally absent of what is going on and you're oblivious, and having that disconnect, having that responsibility, that's where your legacy comes in. And like you said, living your legacy, not waiting for your kids to graduate, not waiting for the house to be paid off or the
Yeah.
retirement, because there's so many people that I work with and talk to that they got to the retirement and they were thinking that it was going to be the golden age, but it was golden for someone else because all their gold was getting dispersed for all the medical bills and
Yeah.
all the care that was needed. And it wasn't golden years, it was more bronze, if it was even that.
Yeah.
And that leaving that legacy, I ran into a lady I didn't even recognize or didn't even know who she was. 20 years earlier, I had picked her and her daughter up in a snowstorm on a highway going
Hmm.
into town. And she saw me in a grocery store and she came up and she said, "You're the guy." And I'm like, "Oh, what did I do?" I mean, and I said, "What do you mean I'm the guy?" And she said, "You're the one that really saved us from what we don't even know. You picked us up in a snowstorm. It was so bad that time that our car went into a ditch and we were walking, and we probably wouldn't have made it to town had it not been for you,
Hmm.
because there wasn't much traffic on the road. And I just happened to be, I had a 4-wheel drive truck and I just stopped and picked people up. And 20 years later, she remembered me.
Hmm.
And we never know the impact that we're leaving on the people that we're working with, even as a bystander or as a byproduct, just a small token. And when we do this with the people that we're around continually, and especially in employment and companies where we're leading other people, I think it's so critical that having that radical responsibility and making that impact and displaying that. Um,
Absolutely. But the other thing is that we create a living legacy for ourselves.
yeah.
I don't know why is it that a piece of chocolate cake always seems so much more appealing than a carrot or an apple. But ultimately, what we eat, what we put in our bodies, whether we exercise, whether we hydrate, how we talk to one another, go back to how we talk to one another, to ourselves. And I'd ask the question, do you speak to yourself as
Mhm.
you speak to other people? Because
Mhm.
many people have a completely different set of criteria for themselves than they do. They're far more critical of themselves than they are of other people.
Right.
And that voice goes round and round and round in their head, and it's corrosive. So if you're saying you're not good enough, you're too tall, too short, too fat, too thin, not clever enough, whatever it is, do yourself a favor. Create a situation where you become your own best friend and treat yourself at least as well as you would your favorite friend. No better, but no worse. And think about the language that you use when you're talking of yourself. Find it quite interesting because, running training programs, I'll often say to people, right, okay, I want you to write down 5 things that you really like about or admire about yourself or you're proud of. And people will struggle, and a significant proportion of people will struggle to do that, even though they may be high flyers, CEOs, C-suite, and above. Then say, right, I'd like you to write 5 things that you feel really need to be changed or developed. They can write reams, page after page after page.
Right.
When you then say, think of a colleague, they don't have any problems at all in identifying what they admire in other people, but they struggle for themselves. And I
Mhm.
think it's time to redress the balance. I'll share with you a technique that one of my clients created, really. We were talking about the voice in her head, and I said, what does it sound like? And she said, it sounds like a flaming parrot that keeps squawking at me. And it's very noisy and it makes my head hurt and I can't stand it. But it's going round and round and round, saying the same things. And at the basis of all of this, that she wasn't good enough. So I said to her, what do you do with a parrot that's in a cage? Not that I'd like to see parrots in cages, but it's in a cage. What do you do to make it quiet? She said, well, you put a cloth over it and put it in the dark. But I'm going to go one better. I'm going to shoot the blooming parrot. And it made her laugh. And
Mhm.
she broke the state by laughing about it. And so I have a technique now so that if you have got that voice going round in your head, then shoot the blooming parrot. And think about a cartoon parrot with a big blunderbuss and shoot it with feathers everywhere. No real parrots hurt in this particular strategy. It'll make you smile. And in doing so, you break the cycle. And then instead of thinking about all of the things you can't do or you're no good at, just choose a couple of things that you can do. And for me, it's all about having a can do approach to life. Instead
Mhm.
of focusing on all the things you can't, focus on the things that you can. And for those who don't know me, that is a strategy that came to me when I've learned to walk twice as an adult. I've had vast tracts of time when I've been completely wheelchair bound, and I ran my school for over 20 years, for the most part from a wheelchair. And that was because I focused on what I could do rather than what I couldn't. And I think if you have that approach to life, you will find the quality of your life and of those around you will shift significantly.
I love that. Yeah, that shifting and what you can do. That is because we if you were to write down or if a person was to write down just their thoughts in, let's say, 10 minutes, not
Yeah.
even a whole day, just for 10 minutes, every thought that came into their mind, I think one of those thoughts would be, I can't do this.
Yeah. I
This
mean,
is too
one
difficult.
one of the things that when you become wheelchair bound is you have to be very good at finding solutions, because it's better now than it was when I was first wheelchair bound in 1987. Um, but ultimately, you have to find ways to do things that perhaps are not the norm. You also need a very, very well developed sense of humor, I have to say, because it's better to laugh at these things than cry. And there have been a fair number of tears at times, but not staying there. But I'd like to share a story, if I may, about our limiting beliefs. 2006, I'd left headship in late 2004. I could walk. I'd had an internal spinal stimulator fitted in late 2004, like an internal TENS machine. So by this time, I could walk very, very few steps unaided. But I'd done a lot of training. I'd by this time become an NLP master practitioner. I'd got my own business by this time. And having done my master practitioner training and my NLP coach training with the same organization, I decided I wanted to go and see as many people using NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, as I could. And I ended up at the Excel Centre in London, which is a huge area, on a Tony Robbins course. Those of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Tony Robbins. 10,000 people on the course. So I went very cynically thinking, big American, it's all going to be a lot of hype. And I was blown away by what he was saying. And I thought, here is somebody who is using NLP, not as a tool to NLP you, but actually using it as a way of helping people recognize the value of themselves. And in the morning, he was talking about a course that he was running in California. And in those days, I didn't have a travel electric chair. Now, you have to bear in mind that not only did I run my award-winning school, but I went and did external jobs to bring an income into school because our budget was so bad. So I worked for the National College of Leadership as a trainer facilitator. I worked for the London Institute as a trainer facilitator assessor. I worked for the government as a workforce reform advisor, all to bring a budget into school. But all of those required me to travel. But I would use the same taxi driver who would pick me up from home, take me to wherever I was going, wait for me, and then bring me home. So when Tony Robbins was talking about this course in California, and I thought, I've never traveled abroad on my own, I just dismissed it. But in the afternoon, late afternoon, we did the fire walk. And for those who don't know what that is, that's walking over hot coals about 30 feet in bare feet. And if you're in the right mindset, then you don't get burned. And all 10,000 people did the fire walk and nobody got burned. And I did it with somebody holding both arms to steady me because I wasn't walking very well at that time. And I was absolutely thrilled to have done the fire walk. And as I sat back in my wheelchair, the guy behind me was a double amputee, no legs below the knee. He tipped himself up onto his hands and he did a handstand walk across hot coals. I was just, well, in the parlance of my kids at school, gobsmacked. I thought, if he can do that, then I'm self-limiting. So I went and booked my ticket, I booked my flight, I did the course, I had a fabulous time. I did all of Tony Robbins' stuff, became a senior leader. And I am thankful to that man because I have no idea who he is, but he changed my perception of what I was capable of. And I know from the feedback I've had from people that I've shared this story with, he's also changed their perception of what they can do. And so I'd ask all of you, how are you self-limiting? Because there is no doubt we all do it. That gentleman opened my world in a way that most people would say. You'd run your school, you'd done all of these things from a wheelchair, you were, you didn't limit yourself. But the reality was, I was limiting myself. And I've no doubt even now, although my world is bigger, there are still times when I say, I can't do that, when the reality is I could perhaps find a way around it. And so my challenge to anyone who's watching or listening to this is, what is it that you're saying no to even before you've given it a try?
Exactly. And I love that story. And since you told me the first time that story, I have told countless people, because if there's anything that we want to do, more than likely somebody has already done it.
Yes.
It's just finding that person. And the way that we find that person is to expose ourselves to the possibility of where that person might show up. And here you needed that person to be there for you, and you had no idea that he was going to be there.
No.
And he showed up and he was in your line. What are the chances of that?
of him being the next person in line, because
Exactly.
there were so many people.
Right.
As soon as my wheelchair had moved away, I wouldn't have seen it.
Yeah. Yeah. And the radical responsibility that you took to yourself
Yeah,
as you watched him display what you wanted to envision and also encapsulate
yeah,
as an experience, and not just in theory but experientially. He was right there, and you said, if he can do that, why can't I?
yeah.
And that's where that radical responsibility comes in. I absolutely love this. um
I think the other thing to say is it's not just about what you can do. More and more, my work with people is about embracing the spiritual dimension of us. We're wrongly named. I think we should be named human doings, not human beings. So for me, that having an awareness of the limitless possibilities is about recognizing that not only is about what we can do, but it's about who we can be, and whether we embrace our inner wisdom, our connection with consciousness or God, call it what you will. I think for me, that's the big frontier, is recognizing ourselves as spiritual beings, spiritual leaders. And when we do embrace that part of ourselves, we open up a completely different dimension of possibilities.
yeah. Yeah. um when Jesus said, I only do what I see my Father doing,
Mhm.
and it brings us back to the Roger Bannister story. The people that followed him, we don't have any idea who the first person was after Roger Bannister.
No.
We don't have any idea who is the first person that broke Roger Bannister's record. We don't have that record. But what we do have is, after all these years, is Roger Bannister is known as the person who broke the 4-minute mile.
Yeah.
And there have been now high school students that have broke the 4-minute mile, but I think you'd be hard pressed to name them. But what we did see is somebody else did it. And if somebody else could do it, why can't I?
You know, there's another great story that I share, and I am told that this is true. As an American student, studying mathematics, couldn't make the last class of a semester. And his tutor said, that's not a problem. I'll put the homework on the board, but you must get this done. It's part of your coursework, and if you don't get it done, you'll fail. So when he came back, he went into the lecture room, he wrote down the equation, and he went and started working on it. And he found it really difficult, but he kept working and he kept working and he kept working. And eventually he found the solution. And he handed it in to his lecturer, who was completely amazed because he'd copied down the wrong equation.
Mm,
Instead of the homework equation, the lecturer had put on an equation which said no mathematician has been able to solve this. But because this young man thought it was possible, and that's the
right,
key, he kept going with the open mind as, well, they wouldn't have set this if it wasn't possible.
right,
So I am going to find the solution because I want to pass this examination. And so if we believe things are possible, we open doors. If we think things are not possible, then the door is locked and closed. And when I work with clients, whether that's looking at their personal lives or we're looking at leaders within companies, what is possible? Because when we take away our own limiting beliefs about what is possible, and we start to engage with ourselves in a different way, then it's just incredible things happen. Richard Branson, for example, talks about using his inner wisdom, his intuition, um, and he looks at the question, have I got enough data? Have I got the right data? But he trusts his intuition to guide him in that way. Um, and I'm just trying to think of the guy's name. He's a billionaire, and my name has gone blank a senior moment. he talks about the fact that he did not use his intuition early on in his career, and it cost him $1 billion.
Mhm.
And so if he's doing a big financial deal, he will always trust his intuition to tell him.
Mhm.
And I know when I was a principal, head teacher, I would have feelings about staff when I was appointing them. And early on in my career, I failed to listen, and it was a disaster. And we had to go down the competency route. Later on, not that long after that, there was a young lady we were interviewing, far less experienced than the others. The governors weren't sure, but I said, I'd like to appoint her. She was amazing. You know, when you learn to trust your intuition, and you've got to work with it to know when to trust and when not, it can be a real game changer.
Yeah, it is game changing. And especially when we go into it with that openness of what is possible, what could be, and believing, just like that young man at the board or doing the problem, that he knew that the equation had to be available.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
he wasn't told what wasn't available. And we fear those things. And that's where taking that, bringing it back to that radical responsibility is, what is it that we want? And if it hasn't been done, why couldn't we be the first one to do it?
Yeah.
And it's just looking at it at a different way and being open to the possibility instead of impossible. It's I am possible.
Absolutely.
And there's a great book out there, and it is impossible. It just takes a little bit longer.
Mhm.
And I'm trying to remember the author's name. I have the book. If I looked over, Art Berg, and he is no longer with us, but he wrote a book called Impossible Takes a Little Bit Longer.
Yeah.
And so how would people get a hold of you? How would you direct them to your website? What's the best way to connect with you?
So they can email me, Gina, Gina, at genuinely-u.com. I'm on LinkedIn. If you go to Gina Gardner Associates, I'm on Facebook, Instagram, websites. I've got a number, but go to genuinely-u.com, enlightenedleadership.com, or Gina Gardner Associates, any of those places. But if you really want to have a chat, then Gina at genuinely-u is probably the easiest way.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Gina, it has been my pleasure. And I want to say to our listeners, if you've enjoyed this, share this with someone. I know absolutely, positively, without any doubt, that there is somebody that could use this to help themselves believe more in themselves, and taking that radical responsibility can change the outcome of their life and the relationships that they're involved with. So like, subscribe, and share this. And I just want to say, my words that I say, until we meet the next time, have an outstanding day and make it an outstanding week.